Thanks, Grace, and good morning, CBC. Some exciting stuff before us this morning, some famous stories, two of the most famous stories and miracles of Jesus that we have before us. And so let me start off with a question that might seem a little bit childish because you would ask this type of question to a kid. You don't have to shout it out, but just get into your mind. What is your favorite animal, right? So, I guess I could have asked for you to guess my favorite animal, but I won't make you guess that out loud because I don't know. I might read into that and what you think about me. So let me just tell you what it is, and we'll eliminate the guesswork. My favorite animal growing up, at least, was the cheetah. I had an unhealthy, and I am sure for those around me, an annoying obsession with cheetahs. And I blame two things in particular for that. Three things if you include Chester Cheetos, I did love those as well. But the other two primary ones would be Ranger Rick's zoo books. Anybody grow up with Ranger Rick? And I think he's still around. I looked it up. They've improved it. You've got some online resources there. And so Ranger Rick zoo books, and then the original Nintendo game, World Class Track Meet. Someone else feels this one as well. Yeah, there we go. So did you have the power pad to go with it? Yeah, there we go. All right. I was worried that no one would have a clue what I was talking about there, but this was where the competition in the Glaser home came out between me and my sisters. So in the Nintendo game, you had to race against multiple characters in different Olympic events like the 100-meter dash or hurdles. And eventually you had to go against like the boss of the game, this virtually unbeatable character named the cheetah. And so the cheetah had this status in my mind, right? I could never beat the cheetah. My sisters had to, ironically or fittingly, cheat to beat the cheetah. They didn't use their feet, they used their hands on the pad to beat him. And then through Ranger Rick's zoo books, I discovered that the cheetah was the fastest land animal, running at a top speed of 60 to 70 miles per hour. And I mean, that's just ridiculous speed. You think about like our greatest sprinter. Think about Usain Bolt, who holds the record for the 100-meter dash at 9.58 seconds. That is ridiculously fast. He's achieved a top speed of 28 miles per hour. And in 2012, a cheetah at the Cincinnati Zoo ran 100 meters in less than 6 seconds, getting up to 61 miles an hour in the process. So don't try to run away from them. So as a kid, that defined fast for me. Get that. This was my standard. So if anyone tried to say, hey, so-and-so, they're really fast, I would go, are they faster than a cheetah? I'm like, well, no. They can't outrun a cheetah. And I was unimpressed. My dad was a football coach, and he would tell me, it's like, oh, we're playing such and such team this week. You need to see this player on film. They're so fast. And I know it had to get under his skin when I go, are they faster than a cheetah? Like, no, of course they're not faster than a cheetah. I don't care to see it then, I've seen the top speed, and that was my trump card. If you can't beat a cheetah, I'm not impressed. When we think about the way, bringing this into the context of our passage, the way that Jews viewed Moses, he had a similar cheetah-like status as a prophet in their minds. Through Moses, think about the things that God had done through him. God had delivered his people from slavery in Egypt. He had unleashed never-before-seen acts of power and judgment upon the Egyptians through Moses' hand. He parted the Red Sea so they could cross safely on dry ground. He gave them water from a rock, bread from heaven through Moses. God met with Moses on Mount Sinai. He spoke to Moses, gave him the law. And as we read last week, Moses promised the people in Deuteronomy 18 that a day would come when God would raise up a prophet like him among the people. And then Deuteronomy 34, 10 through 12, ends with this summary note. It's a note really looking forward to the prophets that are to come in Israel's history, all the prophets that come after Moses. And this is the summary statement. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So, hey, we've got this prophet. Are they a greater prophet than Moses? Well, no. Then I'm not interested, right? throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible and Israel's history, no prophet fully matches up to Moses. They're looking for him, but no one has lived up to the hype. And this is the context into which Jesus enters. We've already seen in John's gospel this theme of Jesus' relationship to Moses and his superiority to Moses. John 1:17, it's in the prologue. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And then when we left off last week at the end of chapter 5, Moses was again in focus. In John 5:45 through 47, Jesus says three key things about Moses. First, that Moses is the one in whom many were putting their hope. They're trusting in Moses in some way. Second, that Moses is the one through whom God spoke of and pointed to Jesus. He's the one that's telling them through his writings to look to the Messiah. That's where Moses' hope was. And then third, Jesus shows us that Moses is the one by whom these leaders will be accused. For in rejecting Jesus, they reject the testimony of Moses. And so these words set up John 6. They lead directly into these stories and set the stage for Jesus' fourth major sign in the gospel, where he's going to act in several ways that, as you read it, go, that's really similar to Moses, but it's infinitely superior to Moses. These works show that Jesus isn't just a prophet whom God empowers, that he is himself God incarnate, the source of life and salvation and provision. So here's the main idea that we'll focus our attention on today, is that Jesus is both the prophet greater than Moses, and he is the God of Moses. And we must submit ourselves to him in faith as a result. And so we'll see this theme developed in these two miraculous stories today, beginning with the miracle on the mountain. Jesus is the prophet greater than Moses. So in verses 1 through 15, again, one of the most famous miracles, arguably the most famous miracle for some people. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all four of the Gospels, and it'd be more appropriate to call it the feeding of the 15 to 20,000, as the 5,000 number is only counting the men who were present. So we're talking about a larger audience than just that. And in this story, we see numerous ways Jesus is being set up as both similar to Moses and superior to Moses. So let's just walk through it together, kind of tour the text, and we'll pause at a few points to note some things that we need to see. So verse 1, after this, so some time has passed, John doesn't tell us how much. So after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. So Jesus' popularity is increasing. Large crowds are following, but John reminds us of why. Not because of this wholehearted desire to follow him in obedience, but just a fascination with his miracles. People are there, many people are there for the show. It seems nearly every week that we point back to a key passage in John 2, verses 23 through 25, and that's because it's really looming over all these stories. Remember that it was said there, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. So there's some type of belief. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So these people, many people look like followers externally. But a lot of them are just fans of the traveling miracle show. They just want more signs, more entertainment, more wonders from Jesus, rather than submitting to him in faith and allegiance. So, moving to verses 3 through 4, we have our first major echoes of Moses' story from Exodus. Verse 3, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now this might just seem like John giving us some mere contextual details, but hopefully as you're reading John's gospel, we're noting that John is including these details really intentionally. Often there's more than meets the eye here. And so we see that, for one, in just the statement that Jesus went up on the mountain. It was like scholars can go, well, which mountain is this? Like, why would he call it the mountain? Well, it makes more sense when we understand what it's echoing in the Old Testament. That in Exodus 19:3, and 24:18, and 34:4, These are the places in the Old Testament that this phrase appears, and they're all describing Moses' ascent of Mount Sinai. And so we are getting this echo, this reminder, this allusion to Moses' own trip up the mountain. More than that, the Passover of the Jews is mentioned. This was an annual feast, talked about it already in the gospel, pointing back to God's deliverance of his people from Egypt through Moses. It was a remembrance of the way God had delivered them through these mighty acts of judgment, the ultimate act being the death of the firstborn through the land where God's people were spared by the shed blood of the Passover lamb. And God passed over their home. And so it's no coincidence that in the Passovers that John mentions in his gospel, they all pop up in the context of Jesus' coming death as the sacrificial lamb. So in John 2, we just read it, Jesus was at the temple at the time of Passover, and that's where he speaks of his body as the temple that will be destroyed and raised up in 3 days. Later, in John 11:55, we're told it's Passover time again, and this is really what sets off the final days of Jesus, because you have a comment about the religious leaders who are waiting and plotting to arrest and kill Jesus. And here in John 6, we won't get into it so much this week, but as we continue, it's once again time for the Passover, and Jesus is going to speak graphically later in the chapter about the need to eat his flesh and drink his blood if one is to have life. He's pointing to his sacrifice and the need for us to experience the benefits of that sacrifice through him. And so the scene is set, and pick up now in verses 5 through 6. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" So on the surface, it makes sense that Philip would be asked this question. He was a local from Bethsaida. He should have a good idea on the dining or catering options that are available in the area, right? Like, Philip, you got the lay of the land here. We're not going on to Google or to any other recommendations to get some catering options. So, Philip, which restaurant do you recommend to get bread for these 20,000 people? But more, again, is going on here. Jesus asked Philip a question about their immediate physical needs, but Jesus is going to drive at spiritual realities again, a recurring theme in John's gospel. Jesus doesn't need an overview of the restaurants or marketplaces that are available. So verse 6, we're told that. He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Just want us to meditate on that, think on that, apply that in our own lives. Jesus is more than capable of just taking care of this issue in a private way that doesn't involve Philip at all. But he tests his disciples in the midst of this apparent problem, not so that he can gain new information, but for their good and their transformation. And friends, how often does he do similar things with us? That Jesus is not at a loss for what he's doing in the entire universe, let alone our individual lives. He already knows what he's going to do. And just in this situation, he could have easily just pulled up with a truckload of food. I'm sure questions would still be asked, but could have handled the situation differently. But he knows that the food problem isn't the real problem. He's not chiefly concerned about their hunger, though he is. He's going to show compassion on them. He's concerned about their hearts, and Philip's heart, and the disciples' hearts. And so likewise for us, why doesn't Jesus just, without us knowing or doing anything, just fill up our bank accounts and our pantries to protect us from all illness, disease, and heartache? Why doesn't he just take care of all those things? Why do we ever have to worry about them? Well, it's because he loves us more than that, right? That those are not our real, primary, ultimate issues. He aims at something more important, and he's relentlessly devoted, no matter what it takes, to wean us off of our love of self, of our love of this world and the things of this world, in order that we would know his power and his grace and his sufficiency. So he's inviting his disciples into that. And back to Philip, Jesus asked him where they're going to get their groceries. In verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. So 200 denarii would be about 200 days' worth of pay for a laborer. We're talking about roughly 8 months of someone's annual income just to provide a meal for this crowd. So if we could put that into our context, into some more modern terms, think in terms of like $30,000 to $40,000 for a purchase that would hardly provide a snack for the people present. Doesn't seem like an efficient use of resources. And in the meantime, Andrew shows up in verses 8 and 9. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish." I don't know if there were sarcastic disciples in the group. Maybe not. I feel like I would have been one. I would be rebuked there. Just like, great job, Andrew. This is really helpful. It's going to make a big difference. Obviously, he's not coming and thinking he found a solution. He recognizes the issue and says, "But what are they for so many?" So Philip and Andrew are both thinking at the natural level. Philip's running the numbers at the marketplace and thinking, this doesn't add up. We don't have enough money. Andrew's doing the inventory, and he comes back with a boy's Happy Meal or Lunchable. He's like, this is not gonna do it, right? They're both so focused on the what of the problem in the situation that they've forgotten who is with them, right? They've taken their eyes off Jesus, and they're so focused on the problem. So let's watch the miracle unfold now. Verses 10 through 13. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So it's Jesus like a host at a restaurant. He's seating the people for the meal that they're going to have. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And so these barley loaves would be like poor man's food, poorer bread. And he turns that into a buffet. Jesus takes, again, this Happy Meal, and he treats thousands of people to a free, all-you-can-eat fish dinner. Methods change for reaching people through the years, but this one's still effective. People show up. You can give them an all-you-can-eat fish dinner. The numbers will come. Crowds will be there. No one leaves hungry. They're excited about this. And so verse 12, they had eaten their fill, and when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So just a few things to pay attention to here is that first, Jesus, like Moses, he feeds the people miraculously with this bread from heaven, right? There were just 5 barley loaves, and the bread keeps multiplying. Second thing is Jesus also shows himself like and greater than Elisha the prophet. So you think of the story in 2 Kings 4, Elisha fed 100 people with 20 barley loaves. It's still an impressive feat. Everybody ate their fill, but this is a bit grander than that. And then third, why the 12 baskets? Well, the Jewish people, these disciples would have had like a wicker basket that they would wear as part of their outfit each day. And here, each of the 12 disciples is going to have his own basket of leftovers, his own to-go box, right? That's always a good thing when you walk out with that. And it's going to be a physical reminder of Jesus doing what no one else can do. That he provides what no one else can. And that number 12 is important. That his provision is sufficient for his disciples, all of them. That his provision is sufficient for Israel, all of it, right? Fully sufficient. And so what's the effect of this sign? The people, you can imagine it got a little quiet. They're eating their food. They've been focused on their meal, going back to the buffet. But now they're full, and they're trying to come to terms with what they just experienced. So John tells us in verse 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." If we stopped there, that's a positive statement, right? That's good news. They know the prophecy of Deuteronomy 18 from Moses. A prophet like Moses is going to come. And now they see these works, and they seem to connect the dots. Here he is. We found him. The prophet. The one promised in the Scriptures. We're not told of the disciples' reaction right here, but you could imagine that there might be some excitement as they're a little band of followers. And now all these people seem ready to come to Jesus. The light bulb has come on for them. Time to get ready for an altar call response. Let's enlist the troops. Enlist the masses to be Jesus' followers. This movement seems like it's going to grow by the thousands like that. But verse 15, what does Jesus do? He doesn't strike up the invitation. He leaves. Verse 15, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Like, what an anticlimactic moment. It's like, it just seems like, oh, there's such a buildup. This is all good. And now, as he's about to receive their applause and approval, he leaves them to go to the mountain alone. John 2 is again so relevant, right? Jesus sees through the facade. Jesus sees through the externals of their response, and he sees right to the heart, right to their motives, to their dreams of what it's going to mean for them to have Jesus, their misunderstandings about him, and as a result, he withdraws. And we notice why. That he perceived they were going to come and take him by force to make him king. That's not the wise approach to Jesus. You don't force him to do anything. They're going to force him to be king, whether he likes it or not. We're going to, whether that's going and storming into the government and overthrowing it and putting Jesus in power. They see in Jesus the means to get what they want, and they don't want to take no for an answer. What a wonderful life we'll have when this guy is king. He's healed the sick. He just gave us unlimited food. And he clearly has the power to overthrow Rome. Let's enthrone him. They see Jesus' power, but this is the key. It doesn't lead them to submission. It leads them to think how they can use his power to their own advantage, right? They don't see him as God. They see him more as a genie who can satisfy their appetites. It's tough not to think of the genie in the movie Aladdin. Think through this passage this week where you have both Aladdin and I believe it's Jafar, right? I really got my Disney characters messed up. I wrote it down and I was like, wait, is he in The Lion King? No, that's Scar. So Jafar, the wicked Jafar, who they attempt to use the genie's powers for their own gain, right? Aladdin has more of a transformation. Jafar, not so much. He's evil to the very end. And he's attracted to the genie's power, but ultimately he wants it to be used for himself, for his own benefit. He's tired of being overlooked, and he sees in the genie's power a pathway to getting all he ever wanted. And we need to be cautious of our own tendency to do the same with Jesus. What do the characters think they really need in the story? Money for food, bread and fish, a political ruler to overthrow Rome, like Moses did when he delivered their ancestors from Egypt. And like the people in the story, we can imagine our greatest problems are external ones. A lack of resources, sickness and disease, physical ailments, hunger, thirst, oppression or mistreatment from the government. But Jesus knows what it is we really need. We need him. We don't need water from a well. We need the living water that will satisfy us forever. We don't need an unlimited buffet. We need the bread of life. And we don't need an earthly king or leader to sit on a human throne or in a seat of the government or in the Oval Office. We need the King of Glory who came in humility, not merely to save us from external oppressors, but from our real enemy, to save us from ourselves, to save us from our sin. Matthew 1:21, you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from what? From their sins. He's going to break the bondage of our sin. And so despite what the people thought they needed, Jesus didn't come first as a conquering king to defeat all their political foes. Jesus knew what we really needed, and he came to be a crucified king who would deliver us from our sin. That is why in John 6 he retreats to the mountain in order to refuse an earthly crown. But that is why by the end of this gospel he will march into Jerusalem to embrace a criminal's cross. That's the king that we need. As Edmund Clowney commented on this, Jesus would go to Jerusalem not to wield the spear and bring the judgment, but to receive the spear thrust and to bear the judgment. And so at the end of this story, we just pause and say, what is your response to the crucified and resurrected King, the one who gave himself over to death for our sake and has defeated the grave? Do you trust him for salvation from sin and self? Right now, whatever you're facing in your life, are you trusting in his power, in his provision to give you all that you need, both now and for eternity? Or maybe as you walked in today, you're so focused on all of the earthly problems that you have that you've begun to lose sight of Jesus' power, of Jesus' sufficiency. And to let this be a fresh call to return to him, to look to Jesus, to remember who it is that you belong to rather than what it is you're going through. And that leads to the second story. So we go from the miracle on the mountain to the miracle on the sea, where we see that Jesus is the Lord of Moses. It's not hard to see the similarities to Moses and Jesus' crossing of the sea. Like God, through Moses, led the people safely to the other side of the Red Sea by parting the waters, so Jesus walks upon the water to guide his disciples safely to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It's also not too difficult to see the superiority of Jesus to Moses in this story. Jesus walks on water. That's pretty epic. That's pretty amazing. Moses wasn't doing that. He walked on dry land. But as we look at this story together, I want to point out two larger ways that Jesus reveals himself to be more than Moses' successor. These are ways he shows himself to be Moses' Lord. So first, Jesus reveals his identity as Lord by doing things that only God can do. So we pick up in verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So this is not good. It's dark. Jesus isn't with them. So those are, again, details that have both just literal meaning and also there's symbolic meaning here. When darkness is used in John's gospel, it's not good. When Jesus is not present, it's not good. And so the wind and waves are beating against the boat, seemingly threatening all their lives. And in verse 19, we realize they're in the middle of this big lake, about 3 or 4 miles out. It's time to push the panic button. I would be, right? They don't have their GPS activated. They can't call in and send for help. But in verse 19, something else frightens them. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened, understandably so. Storm will really scare you, but storms we're used to. Water walkers coming out to us. Something's going on, right? Jesus doesn't need a boat, doesn't need a jet ski to get out and care for them. He doesn't even show off otherworldly divine swimming skills to do this. He just walks on the stormy sea. It's tough to wrap our minds around this picture, but it ought to be just an indescribable source of comfort and encouragement for us. To realize that there is nothing in creation, nothing in nature, there's no powerful storm that can stop our King and our Creator from saving and protecting His people. It's no match for Him. He can walk out onto the water. When we covered Matthew's version of this story a few years ago, I mentioned some of the ways people, skeptics, seek alternative explanations to this miracle. Like maybe it was an illusion. Maybe Jesus found a sandbar, like we think about like Wingersheep Beach at low tide. You got like the big sand area that you can walk out on. And maybe that's what was happening, something like that. It just appeared. But he was really walking on sand. He wasn't walking on top of the water. But one of the reasons that people want to explain this away is just for the simple fact, I mentioned this in Matthew as well, that we know people don't walk on water. It's a pretty given reality. And that's the point. Jesus is showing he is more than merely human, more than a man like Moses, that he is God in the flesh. And he does what any reader of the Bible knows only God can do. In the Exodus, God, not Moses ultimately, God parted the waters so that Moses and the people could cross. And in Job 9:8, God is described as the one who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Just as God alone can put galaxies and planets and stars into the universe, so only God can tread upon the waves of the sea, treat them as a walkway. And that's what Jesus does. So that's the first way he reveals his identity. And the second one is by speaking in ways that only God can speak. So he walks out to them, and they're frightened. In Matthew and Mark, we see that they think it's a ghost. So cue the Ghostbusters theme. They're losing their minds. But then in verse 20, Jesus speaks. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Once more, we're pointed back to Moses and the Exodus. There's far more than meets the eye in verse 20. This is a clear allusion, quotation of Exodus 3. So remember that in verses 13 through 14 of Exodus 3, God is calling Moses to go deliver his people, and Moses is not having it, right? Don't want to do it. He's coming up with all of his excuses. And he says here, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" I am the God who is, who was, who will be. And the translation in Greek, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, is ego eimi, I am. We've mentioned before what a major theme those words play in John's Gospel. That there are 7 I am statements where Jesus says, "I am such and such. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life." And there are also at least 7 other I am moments like this where Jesus merely utters these words, ego eimi, I am. And that's exactly what is happening here. Literally, we could translate it, I am, do not be afraid. I am the divine name, Yahweh, your Creator, your Lord, am right here with you. And so think of the impact of these words, that through this simple statement, Jesus is revealing who he truly is. That he is not merely the prophet that God inspired Moses to speak of. He's the God who spoke to Moses. He's the one. This is the Lord with him. Just as Yahweh was with Moses to save him and lead him safely through the waters, now the Son of God, God incarnate, is present with his disciples. And that's what happens in verse 21. It says, "Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." Immediately, problems resolved. Storm's over. Destination is arrived at. And this is again more than just a summary of what happened. This is an allusion to Psalm 107, verses 28 through 30. So there the psalmist describes these men who are in ships on the sea when a stormy wind is brought about by the Lord, causing waves to crash into their vessel. And we're told, verse 28, "Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven." So Yahweh is the one who has power over the storm. He can still it with just a word. He can hush the hurricane with his voice. And in doing so, he brings his people to their destination safely. And friends, this is our hope if we belong to Jesus. For all who've received him, who know him, we don't have to live in fear anymore. The storms don't have to be overwhelming and frightening to us. This is Jesus' command to his disciples in verse 20, and it comes right to us today as well. I am. Do not be afraid. Take heart. I am. Do not fear. Do not be anxious. Trust me. And that's a tough command for us to follow, right? You go, well, that's easy. Because our fears, the doubts that we have, they're powerful things. Relentless things at times. And just because we become followers of Jesus doesn't mean that we break free from the struggle entirely. The Christian life is less like think about how much our kids, they love riding the escalator. It's like any place with an escalator, we're getting on it, right? It's a free theme park for them. And so the escalators are nice. You don't have to do anything. You just kind of step on them and onwards to glory. And we can sometimes want the Christian life to be like that. We responded in faith to Jesus, and we're just riding up the levels until we're with him in the new creation. But the Christian life is far more like what you read in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. There's just toils, snares, troubles, tribulation at every turn. The path of sanctification and transformation is rife with storms, adversity, suffering, persecution, distraction, rejection, and getting knocked around so hard that we have to again and again get up off the ground and refocus our eyes on Jesus and trust fully in him. And so what storms, what fears are tempting you to look away from your Savior and Provider today? What are the things that are so occupying your focus that your eyes are being taken off of Jesus and his sufficiency for you? Is it maybe afraid of losing someone close to you? Afraid of things like declining health, illness, or disease that seem to threaten your life? Afraid of loneliness, afraid of being neglected, because deep down it's really tough for you to believe that just having Jesus alone will satisfy the longings of your hearts. No, I need this person, I need this thing in my life. Or are you just afraid of following Jesus because there's a lot of unknowns with that? There's this call to die to self, to take up our cross. And that's scary when we feel like our way is better, that we can look out for ourselves better than Jesus can. And so we're afraid to step out in faith. And so just hear the call of Jesus today. Don't be afraid. See the signs of this power, his compassion, his provision, his control over the universe, and his unstoppable love and care for his people. And as a result, trust him. That's what John's gospel is all about. We come back to this week after week after week, that we would see these signs and that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of God, and that by believing we'd have life in his name. Not just a life to come, but a life, eternal life that begins now. True life, true satisfying life in him. And so consider these questions as we close in light of that. A few questions for response. First is, have you trusted in Jesus for life and salvation today? If not, that is the call to you. To see these signs, to see the one who provides for all that we need, who himself is all that we need, and to trust in him for life and salvation. Stop going to other sources that can never bring those things and turn to Jesus. Second question would be, presently, are you trusting him and obeying him in whatever situations or storms that you're currently in? Whatever's going on in your life, what is the posture of your heart to Jesus? Is it one where you say that you trust him, but really your actions reveal a different trust? That you really believe in yourself, or you're putting your faith in another, your hope in another, rather than Jesus? So are you trusting him presently? And then the third question would be, will you trust him into the unknown, into the future? When the storms are hitting and we can't really see what's ahead of us, can you trust Jesus then? Knowing that he will do exactly what this passage says and the psalm says, he will get us safely to desired haven. He will get us safely home to the new creation. And so let's pray and ask God that he would help us to trust him. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for these signs that Jesus did before these thousands of people and then just before his disciples, and that these have been written down so that we too would see these signs. We would see who Jesus is by the enabling of your Spirit, and that we would believe, that we would have life, true life in his name. And so, Father, pray for any who are here with us today, any listening, who as they hear those words, they know they have not put their trust in King Jesus. They have not sworn allegiance to King Jesus. They have not submitted to the Lord of the universe in faith. Would you call them to do so today? to bend a knee, to bow before him, not to come to him and see his power and then try to force him to do the things that we want to do, but to see his power and to trust him, to trust you to do what you know is best, to do your will. And Father, for my brothers and sisters in here, as we just recognize the storms of life that we've either gone through, that we're in right now, or the ones that will come, the ones that are on the horizon, whether we see them or not. And would you help us in the midst of those things not to be thrown off so much, beaten down so much, distracted so much that our eyes fixate on the problems, fixate on the things of this world, thinking only of the bigness of the issues before us, but that we would have our eyes fixed on the superior, supreme Lord, Jesus Christ. And so would you do that in our midst today, Father? Whatever people are going through in here, would you help us to take our eyes off of those things, to fix them on Jesus, to entrust those things to him, knowing that you will provide and you will get us safely to the other side. We ask all these things in Christ's name for your glory. Amen.